Hello, welcome to Wargamer. I'm your host, Rob, and this is the first video of its kind that I'm ever going to do. I'm going to make a lore video, and I've not done this before, and I know that there is an established and a pre-set way to do lore videos. It's an Age of Sigmar lore video, and we're going to be covering the Cities of Sigmar. I understand that, but I'm not really good at sitting down and reading through the books and then writing a script. It's not really my style. So instead, we've decided to do a slightly different style of video, and I hope this is something that's of interest to you. So what we've done over the past few weeks, and I'm recording this intro as I've actually finished the video, is me and the chat, when we've had time, is we've gone through the pages of the Cities of Sigmar battle tome, and we've read through it, and we've discussed what we think the author's trying to say, how it relates to the in-world narrative, what it's saying about external world narratives, as well as being generally interested in some of the stuff that's been happening in the past. We reference like history and lore that's been leading up to, history and lore from Age of Sigmar that's been leading up to where we're at now and where the Cities of Sigmar is now. And this is the first of probably two videos where the second video we go on to describe all of the units and, their background as well. It's fairly long, I think. If you're looking at the time marker, I reckon it's probably around 2 to 3 hours. And it's an in-depth look. And hopefully it's of interest. I know, like, generally short form, quick videos work quite well for lore, but I don't really want what a City of Sigmar in 5 minutes. I don't want that. I want to really talk about it and explain it and think about it and have a conversation. So I hope this is a journey that you enjoy, and I hope this is a video that you like. And if you do, then obviously leave comments and subscribe and all that other stuff. But most importantly, let me know. And let me know ways you think I can improve doing this sort of video in the future, because I'm never ever going to do lore videos that are like 8 minutes long or like fit an algorithm. Instead, I want to absolutely rip something like this apart, deep dive it, and get into the nitty gritty, because it's a really fun endeavor and I've really enjoyed it. So without talking anymore, let's go talk about the Cities of Sigmar. The opening page to the Cities of Sigmar battle tome is kind of a statement of intent for what the Cities of Sigmar, or the denizens of the Cities of Sigmar, are going to try to achieve. It's fronted by a picture of a steel helm with a coin malleus wrapped around his neck, and it goes on to use some very fiery language to explain what they intend to do in these crusades in recapturing the mortal realms. Important to note, in the history of the Age of Sigmar, at one point all of the realms were very, very populated by cultures and cities and worlds, and they were destroyed by the rise of chaos, an insidious force. It took centuries for those to come to fruition, and then they were in charge for centuries more. The beginning of Age of Sigmar is actually the launch of Sigmar's reclaiming of the realms from his bastion, where he hid from the forces of chaos. The forces of chaos were ravaging the land at the time, with humans literally turned into races, or like kind of small little groups that were just running and hiding. And it does say that in this kind of first line. It says, this is us taking back that which was ours. Once these foul lands were whole, some were paradises, and we the blessed. Since the coming of the dark ones, they have been ruined, corrupted and ravaged, still we seed them not. So this is, with the coming of Sigmar and the Sigmarite forces, as well as the other creatures of the realms, this is a statement of intent on the first page on what they're going to do. They also reference the Great Wheel, which is part of the cult of Sigmar, this Great Wheel. It's kind of interesting. It's taken from Anglo-Saxon times, which the chat and me have just been talking about. And the idea is that life is a perpetual grinding motion, where a new generation moves across the wheel, and then that informs the past as it goes in a cyclical nature. I feel like this is maybe lifted directly straight from Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time. I think potentially, but it's also got like a very grindy nature, and it's a little bit sad and grim dark. So that's the statement of intent. That's Cities in a nutshell, and they use some like pretty overt kind of religious tones. They talk about faith, fire, and fury, and they also use the River of Blood's line, which is a bit of a yikes moment. But that's the first page. That's the statement. That's what they're doing. The cities are here. The races of the cities are here to reclaim the mortal realms. Let's find them out. Let's find out more about them. The setting starts to be established in the first page, with us understanding where the humans really sit in the Cities of Sigmar. instead of them all being these elite super soldiers like you would get with something like Stormcast Eternals or Space Marines, they are the humans of these city-states. And these city-states are each their own island in a absolute realm of chaos. They are these small kind of bastions against a chaos which regularly, and not just the forces of chaos, but the armies of kind of destruction and everything else, which regularly attacks them. Those armies are made up of peoples who are press-ganged by circumstance because they are in in many ways, they're in enemy territory, which was once previously their territory. There's a really nice kind of dichotomy with real-world kind of references here, where these ultimately kind of like the peoples in this situation really represent kind of the city-states that you would maybe see like with Saladin. We talked about this in the chat a moment ago, where all these city-states are trying to club together to fight off this enemy, but it's not a single unified enemy. It's multiple different enemies and multiple different factions that each are assailing this individual city-state. And then that city, or these different individual city-states. So it's not also similar to the Imperium, which is a monolithic single entity made up of many worlds, of course, and many different kind of like cultures. But all of those are working towards the goal of the Imperium. All of these city-states are always working towards the goal of, well, kind of Sigmar and the God King, I guess, but most importantly, and definitely for the humans, it does go on to describe that those aren't really the concerns of the regular humans in the realms. Instead, what they're looking to do is they're looking to just protect their city, their family, and their local area, effectively. And they do this through the formation of these kind of castle and city castles and these outposts. That's what they do. And they're just regular human dudes, basically. And most of them aren't like trained soldiers, or they are trained soldiers a bit, but then they're a baker, but then the city gets attacked, and then they stop being a baker and they run off and they become a soldier on the walls. And that's why, especially when you look at the human Cities of Sigmar range, there's many of the kind of like motifs that we see. It's like castles are interwoven into the very idea of how humans survive in the mortal realms. They build a little outpost. That outpost becomes a city or a town or a city, all of which are walled and castled and gated, and then they repel the invaders. And those invaders are consistently attacking them. They themselves are the invaders, but they're also on a procession of reclamation, which I think is interesting as well. One of the things that's important is the way they do this is they then do it in a crusade. So these regular human dudes go out there, fight for their like families, and it does go on to describe quite like a grimdark nature of the humans, like the young of a family being sent out to go find the new land. In fact, it actually says that Sigmar decries that they need to go forth and multiply, or go forth and conquer the land, which is again with real world connotations feels a little bit icky, but important to note that the forces of chaos outside of this land are very destructive. Very destructive. We've talked about maybe using the word evil or not using the word evil, because I think that's kind of interesting. Slaves of Darkness and Chaos Warriors, or actual demons, it's fair to say, are, they enact a lot of evil actions. But also, it's worth talking about the fact that many of those humans, because there's loads of humans in the chaos forces, but they're because those humans were subjugated as a people and then developed this society because of the invasion of chaos, which is interesting. So they're, I guess, in some ways kind of the fallen, or also fallen. There's a very small line in this book about how the humans lived with the elves and the Dwarden and the ogres. I think we're going to expand on that later, and hopefully the book expands on it more. But this is very much talking about how the humans operate. So they're regular people almost all the time. There's very few kind of like heroic human characters because they don't have ancient bloodlines. They're not vampires. They're not descended from elves. They don't have any celestial powers in most of the cases, which is interesting. And then, so they're just the people trying their hardest to go out there. Not a lot of stuff about class stuff at the minute as well. One of the things that is really interesting in here, again, it talks about the conclave. So these are the organizational powers in each city-state, and how they are very unsure about the Crusades and the going out and sending reams, thousands, tens of thousands of these humans into the mortal realms to fight off chaos or destruction or death or whatever it might be. to try to conquer those pieces of land, they're in a really tough position because, and unlike the Imperium, where they're like, absolutely, this is the right thing to do, and I'm sure we will find some characters in the Cities of Sigmar who are, vehement, kind of like, they truly believe, they have the faith, they're true believers that you should go out there and do this for Sigmar and for humans. The first page of describing the Cities of Sigmar is saying that the conclaves or the leadership of each of these city-states is not faithful, not committed to the idea that what they're doing is the right course of action. In fact, they believe it to be a forlorn hope, which is very interesting. A forlorn hope for the humans going out there into the realms, which is fun. And don't forget, they're trying to they're trying to stoke the embers of what was once a great crusade organized by Sigmar. Sigmar landed, he brought all the Stormcast down, he took a bunch of Chaos Citadels, he established order and civilization, and then the humans are left to go and finish the job. And the problem is the humans might not have the power to do that. So they're a defensive kind of like turtle culture. They are assailed on all sides and offended and attacked on all sides, as well as staving off internal strifes through like cults that belong to Chaos and all those other things as well. And then and that's kind of our kind of like initial kind of look at what the Cities of Sigmar and what that's the backdrop for humans, I guess, in the cities and the cities themselves. We then start to learn about how the Cities of Sigmar are founded. How do they go and establish these places in the realms, and then how do they build up into these massive cities, which obviously you can play in the game, and some of them even have their own history and lore. Starts out with effectively a crusade, some homesteading, some classic homesteading, and a group of humans. And it doesn't go on to say this in here. It doesn't say that there are like pack trains and stuff, but I'm assuming if you're going to start building cities and walls and other stuff, and settlements, you're going to need to bring a population with you as well, and they're led by some Stormcast Eternals. Now, the original cities, or the cities at the beginning of Age of Sigmar, were almost always built around realm gates, which are like the Stargate from the TV show Stargate, effectively just a teleporter. There are 8 different realms, and those different realm gates go to different other realm gates, and you can jump around. There's also, and we'll talk about this in a future lore video, there's also a kind of central point, the All Points, where there are lots of big realm gates which join up all these regions, but that's currently owned by Chaos. Anyway, so the realm gates are where some of these original cities are founded, but it doesn't seem to be the process of where they now found new cities. Maybe that's because they've just stopped selling realm gates, Games Workshop have, so they've had to move it on. But what they do now do is they find a nexus point that exists along a ley line. And this nexus point is like a magical point. So a Stormcast, kind of like vanguard, will push out onto the front lines against, the encroaching darkness or the enemy or whatever you want to describe it as. And then they'll bring some humans along with them, elves, dwarfs as well, probably as well. And then they'll found it, and then they'll take over, they'll bring one of these crusades into one of these nexus points, and then they'll start to establish, a small town or a hamlet or a settlement on there, which is interesting. And they do this because they generate water, or they siphon water off from one of these nexus points, and they use that to create a magical barrier, like a Gungan shield from Star Wars, and that keeps out ghosts, and it keeps out magical entities. And then it also powers up these things called, they're called Guardian Idols, which Games Workshop do sell a terrain piece with these kind of like Guardian Idol models, I'm pretty certain. And the idea is that they form a magical and also physical barrier, which I think is quite interesting. So they establish a very small, immediate fortification, effectively, on a magical point. And from that point on, the Stormcast leave. They fly off to the front lines and they start battling and pushing the darkness or the enemy, or however you want to describe it, or the absolute beast of chaos back into the, away from this settlement. And some of these settlements fail and some of them survive, which is kind of interesting. And if they survive long enough, and I think it's probably quite a high attrition rate. I don't think lots of them actually survive. And it does say that sometimes multiple crusades, so multiple kind of baggage trains of humans and settlers, get sent to this place to eventually take it over. And when they do finally take it over, they then import something called Lifewater. Now, it's quite interesting because there's a realm of metal where there's almost like an infinite amount of metal. Like gold and other stuff isn't the currency of the realms. And it's said, I think it's Aqua Gyranis, which is this kind of, it's life water from the realm of life. And even like a single drop of it can like, cleanse a well of, it's holy water, basically. It can cleanse a well of like chaos and stuff. So it's a cleansing stuff, and they use this to cleanse the land because we're going into these chaos areas or these desecrated areas, and they use it to cleanse the land so they can start building, start growing crops and doing all the other normal stuff that these people want to do. So they cleanse the land, and that's what they do. Now, if the settlement survives long enough, they build up shanty towns and they build up like little forts and all these other things. If they eventually end up now, also, thanks to Scott B in the chat for also pointing out that life water, War of Life, is a common term in many cultures. Usually ends up being a name for what we now think of as booze. So maybe they're just boozing it up, like our legend in the Cities of Sigmar, Barry the Cannon Operator. However, I'm proud of you for not calling it Alariel's bathwater. It's not Alariel's bathwater. Definitely not. It's definitely some mythical, magical holy water, but Alariel's bathwater makes more sense. They use Alariel's bathwater to cleanse the realm or cleanse that little area. Now, if the city survives long enough, then the Stormcast, who initially kind of led them to their little area, will come back, and then they will start to like involve themselves in that community. And at the very heart of that town / future city, they'll start to build a Stormkeep where those Stormcast are going to survive. This actually kind of adds or live and prosper, and they'll start to take part in city politics. We'll talk about that in a minute. One of the really interesting things about this is obviously this is the settler narrative. This is manifest destiny. This is all those other things. And while that's stuff we've seen in real history and stuff we've also seen in fantasy before, what I find quite interesting about this is adding Stormcast into that mix, because now you kind of ask yourself, like, what's the purpose of these Crusades themselves? They're obviously directed straight from Sigmar. Is Sigmar saying, go out so I can build myself another Stormkeep? You sacrifice thousands of human lives, that's fine. I just need my boys in gold, have another Stormkeep further out in the reaches and build another bastion. And you guys are literally defending, it's a castle, city wall, and city state defending against the forces, and then the Stormkeep in the middle. So they effectively build themselves like another defensive outpost with very limited amount of Stormcast actually involved in that role. It's kind of interesting, I think. So as the town develops, then Dwarden and elves and everything, basically they just turn it into like this really interesting metropolis where the Dwarden obviously do all like the masonry and the metalwork and everything, and then the elves come in and they put in all this elven stuff and magic and mythical stuff. What I find really cool about this is kind of exactly what I would want from the Cities of Sigmar. We don't see this play out in the miniatures, and we don't see this play out also, on the tabletop, which is a bit of a shame. That cosmopolitan history of the realms is something that I've always really liked. It is not independent. It's not the elven nations versus the dwarven nations. It is a cosmopolitan grouping of different peoples who bring their cultural and racial expertise to bear to create a better society, which I think is fun, but I think most of this book is going to focus on the humans, which I think is a little bit of a shame, in my personal opinion. So there we go. So they end up building, like big castle walls. They build a new front wall. They put loads of artillery pieces in there. That's what they do. Now, one of the things that the book then goes on to describe is that when they do build a new curtain wall for their city, that the poor people who are mainly living outside of the castle wall get more chance to, get some land inside. This is our first actual kind of look at poverty, and we're going to talk about this maybe in future books. But it's not talked about right here, but it is referenced in other books that when these settlers and these other people do take over these lands, they then go to war with the local, chaos populations or native peoples, and then they subjugate and also enslave them. Because where these these poor people come from is quite interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if we find out that some of the the chaos cultists or even local populations are indeed like enslaved and brought into producing and manufacturing these cities as fast as possible, which I think is kind of like a little bit yikes, in my opinion. And then that's unfortunate. But yeah, there's definitely reference to poorer people. So that means that, we're almost talking about Bretonia in some ways. We definitely have like a caste system with Stormcast at the center, literally at the center of the society. They're knights, they're the chosen ones. Then you have the populace, and then you have the povos on the outside, who may well be like second-class citizens. It's worth pointing out that each one of the city-states is itself culturally very different to each one of the other city-states. How they operate and how they do stuff will all be different to each other. Because they're all from these different cultures. So it's definitely not one amalgamous kind of human grouping, which I think is going to be interesting. Then the whole thing is like eventually it becomes a city, and if it gets big enough to be a city, at the center of it, as I've talked about, you've got this Stormcape kind of bastion where Stormcast will involve themselves in politics, and they'll start being like, they won't be the local police, but they'll definitely like get involved in the running of the city, which is interesting. And then that gives them a direct link to Sigmar, and it makes them an important kind of point in this a node in this ever expanding war against chaos and all these other forces, which is interesting as well. They also obviously try to protect the city. They bring in like all these magical energies as well to protect the city from chaos forces and ghosts and all those other things, expanding on that initial protection that the ley line gives them. And then it just goes on to describe the fact that all of these cities are different to each other. The people of Ghyran, the realm of life, are very different to the people of the realm of metal and all the gingers who live in the realm of fire. Which is cool. So yeah, kind of interesting. The founding is fun, and what's really telling about this kind of narrative for how they found it is how much a lot of the lore that's created by Games Workshop and about this stuff is based around product availability. They don't make realm gates anymore. Some of the biggest cities in the game are based and built around realm gates. Those are the ones that have had narrative, feedback for a long time. And when they were written, realm gates were a product that they sold. Now they don't make realm gates. And so, it's moved on narratively where they're going. And it's interesting watching the product drive the story, which I find quite fun. So that's fun. Now we know how cities are established, kind of start to finish. And I'm sure there's probably more on that. I'm really interested to explore how they engage with the local populations when they do initially found. Also, we should also say that in many other books, because it does sound like the only way for humans to survive is to send out their young, build a city, and then, fight the forces of everyone around them. But in many other books, hamlets are described as being something that exists. Little populations, little small villages and towns of people who, are battling against whichever horrors. And maybe those are just narrative devices that they create so that they can have some sort of like eldritch horror come and take them over. But if that's true, how much is taking the coin Malleus and going on the crusade and founding these city-states part of like Sigmar propaganda? And many forces actually survive. Many humans survive out there. And we know humans survive outside of the infrastructure that is the Cities of Sigmar. There are humans that have made a deal with the Ossiarch Bone Reapers. There are humans maybe that are protected by Fire Slayer holds. There's a bunch of kind of like human and other people's relations, which we haven't seen yet. And I think that'll be interesting as well. Obviously, in order to establish a city, you need one of the Crusades to go out there. And how do they get people, how do they get these humans to sign up, or, the peoples of the Cities of Sigmar, how do they get them to sign up to join these Crusades? Well, there's a couple of different ways, and obviously, and unsurprisingly, there's a load of propaganda around it. So, it starts out with a city getting large enough that it can send a crusade out, because obviously you need enough people to do so. And as it said earlier, or as we talked about earlier, it generally tends to be younger people, which is unsurprising as propaganda works normally quite well on them, or the very old, which is also very fun. However, importantly, when a city gets large enough, it has a conclave. And we did talk about this already. The ruling class in a city, ignoring the Stormcast, is made up of this thing called a Grand Conclave. And a Grand Conclave is made up of 244 democratically elected delegates. Now, we don't know the process of this voting system or who's eligible to vote or a bunch of different stuff. We don't know that so far. But one of the things that we do know is that 244 in numerology is the angel number. Now, I personally obviously am not a numerologist, but the angel number is described as the twin flame. And so I feel like a quick Google search when someone was doing twin flames or, twin-tailed comet, that sort of thing, we ended up with this 244 delegates. It's also just a nice kind of like silly fantasy number to think that there's 244 like delegates. Why that number? It's just super fun. I love that. That's a fun little bit of narrative that they've added in there, which is completely nonsense, and I love it. That's something that really will make my mind tick for a long time, which I really like. So when they do a vote, and then they're like, right, we're going to send out a crusade, and off they go. Which is cool. And just to mention quickly, the Cities of Sigmar so far are very girly pops. We've got numerology. We've had like healing waters and magical waters. We've got ley lines. We've got some real like mysticism in here as well, which is really fun. Yeah, like this is the Gwyneth Paltrow of armies so far, or settings, which I quite like. Okay, very girly pops. And we're pro girly pops. It's important to mention we're pro girly pops. Okay, we got healing crystals. We've got all the things that we need. Right, okay, so 244 people who have been democratically elected get together in a city and they're like, right, we're doing a crusade. Nice. Go out and sign up some people in for this crusade. And the way they do this is the Lord General has all of his his officers who have been he is obviously appointed, goes out and starts signing people up with the coin malleus. So this is like an icon or a token that's absolutely worthless, but it's meant to represent, a spiritual bond between you and Sigmar. It's like a personal oath between you and Sigmar themselves, saying that you're going to join the crusade and you're going to go out there and you're going to go settle the lands. That's what you're going to do. And obviously, in some cases, the idea is that everyone, noble heroes and, young, focused individuals, turn up and they're like, give me a coin malleus. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to do this for Sigmar. But in most cases, probably it's very much like it was back in, human history, where you had press gangs. And it does go on to describe that criminals, especially under sentence of death, are offered to take the coin malleus instead. Other criminals as well, not just ones under a death sentence, are offered that coin. The poor, obviously, routinely, would you rather be poor? We'll give you 5 square meals a day, or 3, or 2, or whatever. I don't know why I picked 5. I think I'm just hungry. We're going to give you a load of square meals a day and send you out. The classic kind of press ganging stuff. But it does say, and then there will be some people who are, the religious or fervent kind of people, or the displaced people from the Age of Chaos. Peoples and groups, and I guess ethnic groups, and cultural groups that were displaced by the Age of Chaos, who want to go and reclaim areas of their land, which maybe is important to them on a cultural or spiritual level, are going to go back out and go grab these areas of land. So they sign up as well, or their descendants obviously sign up. This is about 1,000 years since the Age of Chaos. So it's been a long time. So obviously there's a lot of kind of oral history to kind of keep those angry and rage-filled kind of ideals alive. But there you go. But it does say that the biggest motivating factor is doing a good bit of land grabbing, a good bit of settling. That's the main reason, that if you take the coin malleus, if you join one of these crusades and you do settle a land, you are given a portion of land which is yours, and you can pass down to your descendants through all of history. And so a bit of a classic, look, you're poor here, why don't you get out there and then go grab some land? And this obviously does a couple of things. Number one, it makes us understand why humans want to go do that, obviously improving their lot out there in the world. It also does denote that society, or the societies in the City of Sigmar, will be designed to make sure that there is a poorer part of the population. They're not working towards a bit of equity for everyone, and instead they're bootstraps. It does at this point, I think we can definitely say that Sigmar is a bootstraps kind of a guy. He's like, look, You're not getting, like, I know you're born in this city, but you can't live here. You need to go out there and go grab some land, get out there, fight against all the eldritch horrors and the monsters and of the mortal realms, get yourself a little bit of land and build yourself a little bit of a house. That's what I need you to do. And so that's the overriding factor of why people take this coin, which makes a load of sense. And out they go into the realms. And that's it, really. I'm sure there's probably, like, we haven't touched on it yet, but I'm sure there's probably, like, deserters and there's other stuff. And again, as we've already talked about, there's a lot of propaganda here. Like, it does say in this that some of the propaganda that is, drawn or written or already spoken, but also they do, like, pictures and artworks and stuff. In those cases, many of the humans are all, like, noble and heroic and they look awesome. And all of the monsters, they talk about like Skaven and orcs being drawn as much smaller than they are in real life. So the actual horror of, like, signing up willfully as a young person with the coin malleus, or getting hammered with your mates the night before, and then somehow you've ended up in an army the next day, pretty terrifying. And you're like, oh, it's okay, I've seen pictures of the orcs, they're quite small, don't worry about it, they're not that big. And then you go out there and they're massive. Like, what is that? They're meant to be tiny, which I think is interesting. So no wonder Barry, our cannoneer, famous on the cannoneer kit for the Cities of Sigmar, is drinking so much. He's probably had a nightmarish time. He's like, what is that? Is that the god of death? Time for a drink. So pretty interesting. So that's what happens. That's how they start the crusade. That's where they get their crusading forces from. It's the coin malleus. Which I think is like an interesting thing. And then this becomes, an important symbol to each one of those soldiers, because that's their personal kind of like lodestone, I guess. Not only is it their personal oath, but it's also their, in some cases, curse. These criminals will have been, like, given the choice, go out there and fight the horrors and stuff. I think that's kind of it's you can see why in the promotional work for the Cities of Sigmar stuff they made a big deal out of it. I think it's only when you really get to this stage you really understand how important it will be on a cultural level for each one of these soldiers. So very cool. We've established the process of how we found a new city or start to establish new outposts and cities, and also how crusades are developed from current cities. But there was a time in history of the mortal realms and the Cities of Sigmar where this wasn't quite as well established and the processes weren't as well defined. And there was a time when the very first cities were being founded where the peoples of Azir and also the peoples of the realms were at loggerheads, and that still exists today. So it's kind of like, take a look at that. So if we go back to the beginning of the Age of Sigmar. The Age of Sigmar begins, or at least like game term from when we initially got it, when Stormcast were developed by Sigmar to take back the mortal realms from the Forces of Chaos. The Forces of Chaos who themselves had invaded and taken over most of the realms. Now, I don't think they took a huge foothold in the Realm of Death. Obviously, that belongs to Nagash. But they took over a lot of others, and they destroyed societies and civilizations, and, they pushed humans to, the very edges of the wilds, and they were barely surviving. That's how that's the beginning of the story for many of, like, the Age of Sigmar people, and for us, really, as, like, followers. But we know what the background is. In this setting, when Sigmar lands, he establishes those initial cities, and the way he does that is he gets sends a Stormcast down, obviously, and he liberates a bunch of the humans who have been, like, either under the yoke of chaos or are being hunted by chaos. He then brings them in, and they become the reclaimed. That's what they're known as. They're the reclaimed. So they've literally been saved. Okay, so that's the reclaimed. And then he brings in a bunch of the people from Azir, so like the humans, elves, and Dwarden from Azir, and then they start to form those initial cities. And this causes something called the Great Divide, because you have these pompous, soft, lily-livered, like, people that have experienced almost no pain or suffering from the realm of Azir. And then you have these horror, like these people who've been through horror and war and like all of this terrible stuff, and then they have to then form a society and a structure together which I think is really interesting. Also, I'd like to just note also that the fact that we are no longer in the Age of Chaos is a bit of myth. I reckon, like, after Sigmar and his kind of, like, involvement in the realm, let's say Chaos had taken over 90% of the realms, I reckon now that they've only got, like, 88% of the realms. So there's a bit of, like, a mission accomplished propaganda push from the Stormcast and Sigmar as well, which I'm not really sure is actually something that they've achieved. So jury's out on whether or not they've done that. Anyway, so the people from Azir, like, clad in gold and blue, against, you know, the barefooted, like, and the people of Azir describe the other realms as the lower realms. That's how they describe them. And so the Reclaimed, you know, with nothing to their name, you know, like barefooted, you know, dirty, like hungry, then have to kind of integrate with these. And it does go on to say that most, it's kind of like there's a hopeful bit here, that most of the cities did actually, they put those differences aside and they started to work towards a society. So this would have been what happened about 1,000 years ago in the Age of Sigmar history. Leading up to now, Cities of Sigmar as we now know them is about 1,000 years after the time I'm talking about. But still, there will be peoples coming from Azir, and there will be people, you know, they're still out there actively going and reclaiming. So there's still always going to be that friction and that divide between those people, and also the history of what happened with those people. With the people who stayed in Azir, they basically abandoned the realms, and with the Reclaimed, those are people who fought through all these horrors. So they've got to ask themselves, like, would you have run away to Azir if you could? That's a great question. But it does say that some cities, or at least some like townships or whatever, fell apart because the Reclaimed and the Azerites could not get on with each other. And then you do end up with this very interesting kind of like systemic level of cultural mistrust between these two different groups, which is kind of like I definitely will assume will lead to, even now in the time frame that we're at, they'll end up in these big kind of schisms societally and culturally. And also, if some peoples are looked down on as lessers, then you end up with like obviously a big disparity in that culture, which I think is interesting. But it does say some of those towns and cities didn't survive this problem, but most of them did, and but it's still an ongoing issue as well, which I think is quite fun. Okay, all right, and it definitely is. It's definitely written as there's like a class divide, and as me in the chat have talked about, definitely in other books as well, the Azerites definitely come off as pompous, awful, and terrible, and then you know the Reclaimed are definitely like rough, difficult to manage, and all those other things. So some classic kind of classist tropes written into this, which I think is interesting. And they did then talk about what those first initial crusades were like. So those first initial pushes out from those founding cities, which would be the cities that we talk about, like, you know, we're going to talk about Greywater fastness, we're going to talk about Hallowheart and all those other cities. Those initial foundings, though, were made up of a bunch of Azerites and a bunch of the Reclaimed working together, and they were poorly organised, they didn't work well. Obviously, the Stormcast were at the vanguard of that, pushing forward and grabbing all this territory. But the elves and the dwarfs and the humans didn't really work together in a military fashion and sense, and it did say that many of those initial crusades failed. Many of them, like they would just get 1,000 kind of like peoples together, send them off into the wild, like ill-equipped, ill-informed, and also not working together, and then they would just send them off, and then they would suck, and then they would like, and it does say that much of the mortal realms is there are relics of these crusades where they all fell apart. You know, their vehicles and their way of bringing all their wares were just failed. So this is kind of like letting us know that the militarized version of these crusades that we see now in the Cities of Sigmar and we see in the miniature range and all that other stuff is something that had to be developed, and we're about to learn about that in a minute, which is cool, because the initial ones were such massive failures. And obviously this is very reminiscent of the Crusades in human history, with the Children's Crusade and then actual organized crusades after, which were much more successful, which again, some interesting real world kind of relation. It's really fun, actually. Creating a societal divide between the Azerites and then the Reclaimed really kind of like, I guess gives us as a reader the opportunity to pick. Like, I feel so emotionally immediately drawn to the Reclaimed. I immediately want to be like, yeah, I'd be a Reclaimed. I'm not one of them pompous Azorites. And I'm sure there are some people listening to this, or people at home who are doing like that, like, oh, I probably would have been an Azorite actually, because I'm quite cool and fancy. And it gives the viewer the opportunity to kind of choose their place inside of the society, which is interesting. Or even, you know, oh, I don't like the pompous or horrible people in our society, therefore I don't like the Azorites as well. So giving us that is cool. Giving us that, but also really leads us to have a tenuous kind of like place with these humans, elves, and Dwarden in the mortal realms, and that's also kind of interesting because it's going to create so many schisms and so much story that we can, you know, that the authors can build off. So knowing that the early Crusades were massive failures, they kept you know, enacting them because, you know, they're out there to try and reclaim the lands, and the cost of human lives, as the wheel or the cut of the wheel dictates, is, you know, just the cost of doing business. So changing up their style or changing up their process for doing this actually was not something that was a ongoing series of improvements in this kind of like process, and instead was all down to a single character because of a unique set of problems. So Thalia Vedra, who is one of the new miniatures that's been released, and kind of the, you know, the leader, was originally a mercenary leader. She's kind of the faction leader now at this point, but she was originally a mercenary leader. And the Crusades were already doing pretty badly. There was a high attrition rate for the Crusades in founding new cities. But when the Cruel Boys, or Kragnos was released, and then the Cruel Boys started to come out of their swamps and use, you know, hit and run tactics and all of these ambushing style tactics, that led to an almost complete stop of the Crusades. There was no successes. They just did not succeed. They never got where they needed to go. And in one of these Crusades that was about to lose, effectively, about to, you know, lose all of its people and be defeated by the Cruel Boys, Thalia Vedra was part of this crusade. She was a mercenary captain in this crusade, and the leader of the crusade was murdered by some Cruel Boy bolts. And in this case, she then took over. And what she did was she took all of the shields from the pikemen, and she formed them up with the handgunners. And instead of just having a ragtag, you know, processional force, she created a mobile castle, or the Castalite formation, which is, you know, what it later became. And this was, I guess, revolutionary in some ways. At least it was revolutionary for the Cities of Sigmar and the Crusades and the way that they established it. Normally what they did was they left a castle city, and then they just slumped it through the realms, hoping to get where they got to, where they would then establish another fort. So now the whole thing is an entire fort. And there's a couple of things I really like about this. Number one of the things I really like is it really explains why all of the old Cities of Sigmar miniatures have changed quite drastically to having this shield motif. Because it does go on to say that after this city was successfully founded, then when information got back to Azir, the Azir Council and the Azorite Council, which as we know is made up of, the Conclave, the Azorite Conclave, is made up of 244, you know, democratically elected people. They were like, this is the way now, this is the process, this is how we're doing it. And then a dictate was passed down through to all of the Cities of Sigmar. We're like, right, we need you to build more shields, we need you to put cannons on front, shields on front of cannons and all this other stuff. Like, we need you to, this is the process now, this is the way that works. And interestingly, Thalia then said to them, no, this isn't going to work in some situations. This was a specific process that we developed because of the Cruel Boys in the region we were settling. This might not work in, you know, desert regions or snowy regions. It might not work against different armies as well. One of the things I really like about that is in the future, it gives us some narrative hooks for why we might see completely different styles of Cities of Sigmar units and and military strategy, because they're battling against a different type of enemy. As an example, maybe the Castalite formation or the castle-style formation wouldn't work overly well against gargants, you know, big monstrous things. Instead, maybe it'll be all pikes and hooks, and who knows. That'd be really fun, and they say that towards the end. But Thalia is very much like, this is not the way. But in a very classic human situation, the council were like, no, this worked. like, this worked. Nothing else is working. We're going to do this now. And so all of the Crusades now are using this Castalite style, big shields, handguns, build a mobile castle, which I think is very, very interesting and very cool. So this isn't a process where, people were working this out. They weren't on drawing boards, whiteboards. They weren't in meetings like, we keep losing everyone. Maybe if we gave them shields? Bold idea, Dave. Let's try it out. This was just one leader coming up with an idea that then has been adopted universally, much to that leader's like protestations, like, no, let's not do this, which I think is real interesting. I do like what it does in explaining all of the old minis and how those old minis are now no longer part of the range, and then we've got these new minis as well. Also, it's really fair to say that there's a couple of influences that comes from history and also the Games Workshop range, which I think is fun. Number one, there's the Empire War Wagon, which we saw from Warhammer Fantasy Battle Days, and also the Marienburg Landship, which were, mobile forts and castles that would go through the wilderness and then would create these emplacements. But probably the one that's famous in history is the war wagons from Zika, and I think in this situation, Thalia Vedra is absolutely Zika, the general from history around 1378 is when he's from, established this process of creating war wagons where you literally just had a wagon with a bunch of gunners inside, some guys with flails defending and doing an encircling kind of castle formation, which is really fun. So. And also I like the idea that we may potentially get miniatures for the war wagons in the future. That's very cool. I think that'll be a really hard thing to create rules for, but as minis, I think that'll be really fun. So that's everything to do with the Castalite formation and how we've seen this new style of Cities of Sigmar. And also they go on to say that obviously these might not work in these other landscapes in the future. So we might see a bunch of other style, human style miniatures or cities-based miniatures, as their process of enacting war in those regions is much better. So it's very cool, very cool. But it also puts a lot of respect onto Thalia. So as we've got into this kind of new age, this is an evolution of the story. And the story does even go on to say later on in the book that some people don't adopt, or some cities don't adopt this doctrine, or some armies don't adopt this doctrine. And that's because that's kind of like a kind of conversation with the reader. They're like, actually, if you're going to use all of your old models, then your army is an army that never adopted the new process, which is kind of fun. I like that. That's a nice kind of conversation with and about the game through the lore to the audience, which is super cool. Now we're going to talk about the different cities that you can find in the Cities of Sigmar and across the different realms. But before we do that, we should probably establish what the realms are. There are 8 different realms in the Age of Sigmar, and in kind of the universe of Sigmar. And there's even some in-between realms. There's things like there's where the Skaven live, which also exist between realms as well. There's where the Lumineth live. There's a whole bunch of stuff to kind of explore that isn't just the realms, but a portion of the whole universe are the 8 realms. And those 8 realms are almost like a circle. They're not quite, but they start at the center and they work outwards. And as you get towards the edge of those realms, then you encounter a problem, because the edges of those realms are the manifestation of magic. So the realm of fire, for instance, at the edge of the realm, it will just be an inferno, and it gets kind of progressively more magically chaotic towards the edge of the realm. So society exists from the edge inwards, but there's a place where it just becomes too chaotically and magically wild. So those are the realms, and the peoples of the realms and the nature of the realms are all really infused by the power and magical energy of those realms. For instance, the realm of fire, which is the first one we're going to talk about, is the peoples are known as fiery people who would rather die than ever burn away, fade away. They want to explode and die. The flame, the air is hot and arid. There are cacti and flame dragons and all this other stuff. But there is still green lands. There are lakes. There's more to. It's not just, as I comically would describe it sometimes, just volcano places, which I think is it's not that. It's not just all volcanoes. And instead, it's a little bit more nuanced. There's a lot more to it, but then that's repeated again. The realm of metal, like there's just loads of like ore deposits and stuff, and it goes on. Realm of life, there's lots of trees. That's that sort of classic sort of stuff. So those are the realms. And then inside the realms, they've established some major cities and also some smaller cities as well. The important part, we're going to talk about all of those major cities now, which I think will be fun. When some of those smaller cities are established, they are known as candlelight cities, or like little outposts. Eventually these are small little outposts that Crusades have established that would like one day to eventually become big city-states themselves, which I think is interesting. I think most of the original city-states that we're talking about are founded around realm gates, because that allows you to do realm travel, because you can't walk from the realm of fire to the realm of life. You have to go through a realm gate or a magical portal or something like that. Is exactly what you got to do. So they are almost enclosed ecosystems until the realm gate situation, and you jump around, and they're all based on the 8 kind of like colleges of magic from Warhammer Fantasy Battle Days, which is a throwback to how they were founded in many ways. So there we go. Now, in the Realm of Fire, which is the first one we're going to talk about, there are 3 major cities, and there's a 4th as well. So we're going to have Hammerhall, which we're going to talk about, which is sometimes known as, it's a city which is known as the twin-sited city. There are 2 halves of Hammerhall, and one of them is in the Realm of Fire, and one of them is in the Realm of Life. So Ghyran is the Realm of Life. So that's Hammerhall. Hallowheart, the magical city. And then Tempest Eye, which is kind of like the almost like a hunter city in many ways. Now, there was another city which was made up of pirates and thieves called Anvilgard. However, there was a civil war in the last edition of Age of Sigmar between the Cities of Sigmar and the Daughters of Cain, where Morathi, who wasn't as of yet a goddess herself, she was a demigod, she went to war and she committed kind of treason against Sigmar, and they attacked Anvilgard, and she also ate the souls of loads of long lost dead elven kings, while inside the belly of Slaanesh, who is another god, like an incorporeal god, and while she was in there, she ate loads of like elven souls of dead kings, and then became a goddess, with Slaanesh birthing her as a goddess. That was a little bit of the history in the past. A little less grounded like the Cities of Sigmar stuff, and a little bit more like our high fantasy. But Anvilgard then became Harkuron. So Harkuron is no longer a Cities of Sigmar, and instead is a city-state belonging to, and the capital, I guess, of the Daughters of Cain. So that's what we are. So that's Aqsha, the realm. There's a really cool map, which I'm showing on the YouTube video. So if you're watching it listening to it as a podcast, you can't see. But there are loads of other little city-states as well. And one probably to talk about is Brightspear in the area of Asperia. And that is a city-state that is not a Sigmar city. It's not a Sigmarite city. And it's a city that has survived through the whole of the reign of chaos, and has defended and fended off chaos, and hasn't needed Sigmar or Sigmar's Crusades or Sigmar's people to help it survive. And Sigmar's people, the Cities of Sigmar people, often reach out to Brightspear to ask for help. They're like, oh, can you help us with your magical powers? And Brightspear are like, get lost, nerds. You suck. Yeah. So that's fun. So I love that, which is cool. There's some really fun stuff there. So that's the realm. Let's go talk about the cities. The first city, and the capital, really, of human civilizations in the mortal realms, is Hammerhall. And Hammerhall is a city that's spread across 2 different realms, the Realm of Fire and the Realm of Life. And Hammerhall Aqsha, which is one half of this city, is considered to be the primary of the 2. So this is definitely our capital. This is where human civilization is, and is, this is Earth, if you will, in many ways. Now, this is obviously in the Realm of Fire, so its people are fiery, and it does say in this that you are considered to be a very sturdy elder if you reach the age of 30. to kind of put you through like the horror of war and attrition rate that's going on in this city. And they definitely do obviously reach, some people do reach an older age, and in some cases, because this was the first city that was founded when the Stormcast Eternals, in their first strike, when Sigmar sent out his legions at the very start of kind of the Age of Sigmar to start taking back the realms, this was the first place they landed, fighting against a bunch of different orcs, and also eventually a bunch of the Khorne forces. And then this city was initially built right then. Apparently, even as liberators were swinging hammers into Blood Reavers' faces, they were putting brick upon brick and starting to build these cities. And they built it around the Realm Gate. So the Realm Gate at the heart of this city is where you transfer goods and services over to the Realm of Life. Realm of Life do send back through this super OP item called the Aqua Gyranis. And Aqua Gyranis is something that can cure chaos. A single kind of like drop of it in a well that's been poisoned will cleanse it of everything. It's this mega OP, like absolutely ludicrous super stuff. You put it onto a field and the field will grow the most amazing crop that year, etc. And we have nicknamed it as Alariel's bathwater. Is what it is. But this stuff is so powerful that some of the original founders of the city are still alive. We're not really sure. I think it's 1,000 years. I'm almost certain it's 1,000 years. They're still alive to this day, thanks to the power and the effect of Aqua Gyranis, which is quite interesting. Now, obviously, because it's the Realm of Fire, this is very much described as like, industrial London or industrial Birmingham in the UK. This is a city of industry, using the fire and the heat of of the Realm of Fire to power industry. And this is where I'm assuming most of the armaments and arms for the different kind of Sigmarite expeditions are done. Obviously, all the Stormcast stuff is made in Azir. So that's not going to be stuff that they're talking about. It's not Stormcast style stuff. It's going to be stuff for the human population, the Cities of Sigmar. This is where dwarves and elves live as well. They're part of the infrastructure of this major city. Doesn't really go on to say much else about the city. It doesn't say about the lands outside, whether or not this particular city is broken up into different regions. There is obviously a Stormcast keep at the center of it, and the Hammers of Sigmar, like the poster children, if you will. They're the Ultramarines of Stormcast Eternals. The poster children. This is where they call home. This is their seat from which they conduct all of their politicking into the human population, which is quite interesting. But that's it. That's everything, and obviously it's linked with the realm of Ghyran. Now there is one last bit that they do have kind of like a couple of elite or famous groups, military forces. So they have the Golden Jackets. Or the Gold Jackets, sometimes known as the Golden Lions. So they wear a gold jacket and they represent the Golden Lions, which is fun. There's also the Sunseekers and the Leaden Bulls. And there's also occasionally a big party around Comet's Day, celebrating when the Stormcast Eternals landed and kind of like saved this area, I guess, or started to reclaim this area. And this is known as Comet's Day. That's everything about this particular land, or this particular city. Let's go look at the next one. The next city we're going to talk about is Tempest Eye, and still in the Realm of Fire, a major city founded and based around a bunch of mountains called the Titan Spear Mountains. And these aren't just populated around the base of the mountain. Instead, they're at the base going all the way up to the top, where they have a bunch of skyports where obviously Kharadron Overlord vessels join as well, but they also talk about there being elven skycutters, which is a throwback to a miniature that was released in the past. They also talk about Batarian galleons, which we as of yet know not much about. So it's a skyport city built into a mountainside, which is quite cool. And they have squadrons of gyrobombers and gyrocopters, which they use as an air defense force to protect against the attacks. And they are being attacked constantly. Specifically, they're being attacked by Skaven, of all things. Skaven have somehow got themselves a bunch of blimps, and they're firing rockets and torpedoes, and they're trying to take over Tempest Eye. And while this is happening, at the base of Tempest Eye. So this is obviously they're being attacked in the sky. The Skaven are coming up the mountain and trying to invade from below. The Conclave, again, the kind of the ruling body of the city, have made a decision to try to, instead of pushing against the Skaven, what they've decided to do is create choke points. So as the Skaven try to attack from the base of the city, they block them in and then kind of like hold them at bay. However, there's a rogue element inside this Conclave that has been paying and outfitting different crusades to travel down the mountains and try to push through the Skaven lines to develop more lamp towns and also eventually some more cities, which is fun. So this is definitely a home of industry and also a home of, like the Dwarden and all these skyports. So there'll be lots of trade, which is fun as well. But the fact that the city is currently under both land and air assault is quite an interesting factor. Lastly, the thing to say is this place is the home of the Stormcast Eternal group, the Tempest Lords, or the subfaction, the Tempest Lords, and this is where they make their home. So Tempest Eye is very interesting, especially if you're a Dwarden fan, especially if you're excited about the future. I love the idea of there being Skaven blimps and airships we might see in the future. Still interested in what even the Elven Skycutters are going to be like as well, because that'll be really fun to see. So yeah, very, very cool. The next city that we're going to talk about in the Realm of Fire is Hallowheart, or the City of Mages. Now, this is a really interesting city, and I've learned a lot about this city just very recently. Now, the city is founded on a giant pit where a massive inferno once raged, and was initially flooded and filled with Tzeentch chaos spawn and creatures that it had infested the area. Eventually, that was obviously cleared out, and the city of Hallowheart rose from it, stood upon a massive basalt kind of tower, a big spire with all these like big tendrils and, you know, classic wizard tower stuff. But imagine a giant wizard tower with loads more wizard towers attached to it. And then arching from this wizard tower are loads of walkways which lead to mining camps. And those mining camps are the reason that Hallowheart exists, and also where the main wealth is generated from this city. They generate loads of wealth from all of the alchemic and arcane stones that they mine there. Those mines are still absolutely flooded and filled with loads of, Tzeentch creatures and, denizens of the dark and all your kind of classic stuff, which is fun. Inside the city itself, the Stormcast Eternals chamber that's attached to this are called the Hallowed Knights. And their job there is to try and still get rid of the corruption that exists around there. There's still lots of Tzeentchian influence affecting the area. And then they do have the wizards there are quite famously quite insane. They love experimenting stuff they shouldn't be experimenting with. Loads of the regular humans in the city are like, could you stop doing that? And they're like, no way, gonna do some crazy spells. But those crazy spells do work when the enemy come knocking. They normally blast them to pieces, and they're in a really good spot in that situation, which is good. So they do have this kind of arcane power, but that arcane power sometimes goes very wrong and it turns on the citizenry itself. Also, obviously all the wizards have all of the cultural power in the city as well, and the conclave that's a part of the city, don't forget, conclave, each city is ruled by a conclave made up of 244 elected people, but unsurprisingly there's some special interest groups here, which is all to do with the wizards. They're called the Whitefire Court, and they have an overpowering effect on the conclave. So normally whatever the wizards want, the wizards basically get. And then the humans are quite annoyed because the wizards are quite excited to go out into the area around and try and find all of these relics and lost artifacts that were from the pre-existing magocracy, the Agloxian Empire, which is interesting. They had a bunch of magical. The thing to remember, they had a bunch of magical users. The thing to remember is that all of the cities of Sigmar, I know I've said this already, but I'll say it again, is a post-apocalypse. This is a new city, Hallowheart, founded upon the embers of an already defunct society that was destroyed during the Realm of Chaos in the post-apocalypse, and the Agloxian Empire was the magocracy that was previously there. So they created these incredible works and all these amazing kind of like structures and laser beams and all this other stuff. But they ended up like destroying themselves because they were just, they didn't stop to ask whether or not they should. They just were like, I wonder if we could do this, and they did. So that's what it was. And now we've got this amazing magic city where there's all these mines. And I do like one of the things I really like about this is the friction between obviously the mages of the city and then the general human populace. I already now kind of want to do or build or produce like a Hallowheart army where just all of the soldiery just hate the wizards. Like the wizards are like blasting magic and doing stuff. You're like, that's actually quite useful, but I don't like you. You're not cool people. That's very fun. It's very, very cool. It's actually my favorite so far, I think, which is good. Next, we're going to talk about the Realm of Life and the cities that are based inside of it. And the Realm of Life is a strategic stronghold for the Cities of Sigmar and the Forces of Sigmar, unsurprisingly because it is a breadbasket. It's where most of the food and all of the victuals are created and grown because it is obviously an abundant land. It's a realm, as always, infused with the power of the magic it embodies, which is life. And therefore, there are loads and loads of opportunities to grow and feed all of the populations in the other realms. As we've talked about it before, the realm gates create a nexus through which all of these supplies can be pushed and delivered. That's our like infrastructure system, those realm gates, which is interesting. So the Realm of Life is also the domain of Alarielle. Now she's the goddess of life and the faction leader for the Sylvaneth force. She has an alliance with Sigmar because in the Age of Myth, Alarielle and Sigmar were best buds, or they were at least on the same council. There's a little bit here, where I think maybe there was a bit of a relationship that happened in the past. That makes a lot of sense. Don't forget, Sigmar isn't a Stormcast. He creates a Stormcast. Sigmar's just a bro, based off, Thor and Greek gods from the past. So it makes sense, along with Alarielle, the goddess of life, that there was something that kicked off there. But either way, they have an alliance for now because Alarielle recognizes that while she isn't massively a fan of human beings themselves or the destruction and, deforestation and all that other stuff that they commit, she recognizes that they are a much better bedfellow than the Forces of Chaos. Don't forget the Forces of Chaos are taken over, have still got control of huge places in the Realm of Life. So they are in an alliance and they're battling against the realm. Alarielle provides supplies also to the Cities of Sigmar through this alliance, and then the Realm of Life itself provides all of this food to all of the Cities of Sigmar around, the different realms and campaigns and other stuff. The Realm of Life is also home to the currency that the humans, or most of probably Order faction, use, which is the Aqua Gyranis, or Alarielle's bathwater. This is a source of life which it can heal people, it can cure people of ills, and importantly, it's used to spread the taint, cleanse the realm or areas of the taint of chaos. So it is not only something that is life-giving and life-saving, it also helps to create more prosperity and also safety in the realms. And me and the chat have talked about this, and it was a really good kind of analysis of what money does in actual society as well. Money, if you have enough money, you can pay for loads of good healthcare, which is really good. But if you don't and it's all hoarded, then, people starve, and that's what we've effectively seen from real life money. And it would be interesting to see if later in this book or later on in the timeline of the Age of Sigmar, if the Aqua Gyranis either gets infected and it isn't able to be used as much, or if someone starts to hoard it, and if we get to see that kind of like that real world problem that we face in people hoarding all their money so it doesn't go to society, and instead and therefore cities start to get re-corrupted, or it's a really nice kind of parallel which I really enjoy. So that's very fun, very, very fun, which we really like. Traditionally, the enemies in the Realm of Life has always been Nurgle. Nurgle, while a god who is focused on producing disease, never wants to kill anyone, and instead wants more and more growth and more disease to be spread. In fact, Nurgle's home is a garden, in fact. So there's always been this singular battle between Alarielle and Nurgle. And so it's a very green and very kind of, nature-based war zone, which I find to be very interesting as well. There's some really famous cities here. We're going to be talking about Living City. We're going to talk about Hammerhall Ghyra, which is the other side of Hammerhall. We're going to talk about Greywater, fastness, and the Phonecium. So there are some really interesting cities in here as well. And this has been maybe one of the more fleshed out realms that have been that's in the Age of Sigmar canon and lore, because it's one of the first realms that wars happened in during the very beginning of the Age of Sigmar. And so there's a lot of canon in this. Even the founding of Alarielle, Alarielle at the beginning of the Age of Sigmar was not born, or she wasn't alive at that point. She was hiding inside a soul pod. So it's a really interesting space with lots of rich backstory, which we can cover in some later videos. The first city to talk about in the Realm of Life is Hammerhall Ghyra. Now, don't forget, we already talked about Hammerhall in the Realm of Fire, and that's because it's a twin city, with one half being in the Realm of Fire and one half being in the Realm of Life. And in fact, they can't really survive without each other. With the Realm of Fire, through the big realm gate that they're based around, they send streams of magma, which Hammerhall Ghyra, so the one in the Realm of Life, uses to fend off the wilderness and the vegetation to make sure that it can't encroach upon the city itself. And then this city is a city completely designed to produce as much food as possible to send that out to all of the other cities. So it gets its armament and supplies from the Realm of Fire, and then the Realm of Life produces all of the food. The Realm of Life city is also, as it says in the lore, a land of plenty, where many of the patrons of the city make lots of babies. That's what I'm going to say. They have lots of babies. And so it is a realm of plenty, but it's also a realm of, it's a city of hard labor, a city where everyone is geared towards producing as much food as possible, and then the rest of the city is designed around ensuring that the food and the city itself does not succumb to the wilderness. Also, as I talked about, constantly assailed by the diseases, whether or not it's from Nurgle or whether or not it's from, clan pestilence, from the Skaven. They're constantly under attack. Every city, you have to assume, is consistently under attack, but it depends really what it's being under attack from. And in this case, it's the forces of disease and corruption, which makes a lot of sense, as obviously they're kind of natural enemies. It also does say, and we kind of talked about this already, but the way Thalia Vedra set up the way that the Crusades would work, with our steel helms and our fusiliers, with the big shields and cog forts, which they mentioned, which would be a great miniature to see in the future, doesn't work in the heavily forested, thicketed Realm of Life. And so they have to completely redesign how they send out these different Crusades, which is really funny because obviously, the Azerites or the Azerite Council were just like, cool, all of the nations do this now, and then as soon as you get to the second largest city, that immediately is not the right way to go about it. So instead, from the Realm of Life, Hammerhall, what they do is they send out big columns of infantry, don't take out a lot of cog forts, probably don't take a lot of machines. They just send out a lot of people to chop through as much of the forested area as possible to go find some new cities. And I'm sure in some cases they have some support from the Sylvaneth factions as well, which I think is really interesting, that immediately the system for establishing new settlements breaks down when you approach this city. So that's Hammerhall Ghyra, and it's built into a cliff face, and it's got lots of fields for food. So it makes me feel like it's a multi-tiered kind of city, which would be very cool to build a scene of one day. I think that's really fun. But yeah, that's Hammerhall Ghyra. The next city is the Living City, and in the Cities of Sigmar book, it gets a paragraph. It doesn't get much, and it's quite an important city. If anything, this is the city that really amplifies the relationship and the alliance between Sylvaneth and Sigmar and the humans and the elves and the dwarfs of the mortal realms. This is almost the capital city for the Sylvaneth. Now, it was built by Alarielle herself, so she She created it out of the earth. And I'm just going to quote it because I think it's worth just saying. The foundations were laid down by the will of the Everqueen herself. In a matter of days, she moulded the city from the clay of the Everspring swath, raising ramparts of impenetrable iron oak and spires of stone that reached to the canopy of the Therian forest. And in doing so, Alarielle creates a haven where the Sylvaneth forces and the Sylvaneth society and culture interact with elves, humans, dwarfs, and everything else. And then, obviously and unsurprisingly, this is a city where the armed forces are great scouts. They know their way through the forest really well, and they are good at ambush and hit-and-run tactics, which is not really a surprise. So that would be an amazing city to have a deep dive on at some point and really explore what that's like, especially that human nature, even like, basics like needing to heat water or, for tasty soup or other things. How does that interact with burning stuffs, which obviously the Sylvaneth are not going to be happy about? So that'll be a really fun kind of like deep dive at some point to see how, because normally it's always some tree people interacting with a much larger human society, and in this is the kingdom of the tree people and the humans, elves, and dwarfs dwarfs especially, with all the industry and manufacturing that they, traditionally in fantasy are trying to do. How they integrate would be really fun to explore, and I personally would like to see. But that's as much as you get in this part of the book. One of the cities that has featured heavily in the background and the story of the Cities of Sigmar has been the Phonecium. And the Phonecium is an interesting city. It was founded when a volcano exploded, but because it's the realm of life, it didn't explode lava. Instead, it exploded a load of jade, or sap, really, which turned into jade eventually. So this big, or amber, sorry, not jade, amber. So a volcano exploded sap while there was a battle happening, and then all of the sap obviously set into amber, and then inside the walls of this city are the people still battling now. They're not moving, but they're trapped inside. Then a bunch of phoenixes turned up, ridden by elves and the Phoenix Guard. And then the phoenixes melted some of the sap, not enough to free everyone, so that there was this constant mist around the Phonecium, so it's difficult to find. And then the elves settled in, where, because it's an elven society and an elven culture, it's pretty much only elves that are allowed to live there or be part of the military, although I'm sure some humans and other people turn up and trade and all of those other things. Now, the Phonecium is not a playable faction in the current Cities of Sigmar book, and the Phonecium backstory is quite interesting because they've also discontinued the miniatures, which they're talking about, like the Phoenix and the Phoenix Guard. They've discontinued those miniatures, so they're not playable in the game as is, and therefore don't really exist in the game. I have a sneaky suspicion that this is where we're going to see Tyrion. Now, Tyrion is Teclis's brother from the world that was. Teclis was the magic user and Tyrion was the kind of combat specialist. And it makes sense, in my personal opinion, that what we're seeing here is really a placeholder for the Phonecium. They're effectively saying the Phoenixes are out for the moment, but they will return in the future, probably led by Tyrion. And then we'll see this whole Phoenix faction based around the city of the Phonecium, which I think is also really interesting as well, because as we know, the life cycle of Ghyran is all about birth and re-death, because it's all about, like nature and the cycle of nature. And that works really well with phoenixes and how they work in fantasy as well, where they die and they come back to life. So I think that'll be a really fun faction when we do see it finally realized. But the fact that it's no longer a playable faction and therefore also not part of the ongoing story is quite a nice representation of what's happening in Age of Sigmar as a grand narrative, because they're still reeling as a company, but also the background writers, they're still reeling from the destruction of the old world, and so they're still creating. Oh, okay, we've got all the phoenixes and miniatures. We'll create the Phonecium. Okay, they're going away now. We'll just kind of park that for a moment, and that kind of organic nature of the writing is because of circumstances happening outside of the narrative. I'm sure the background writers want to create. And that's quite fun. That's quite fun because we end up being like, what is happening with the Phonecium? That's quite interesting. Is it going to go away? Is it going to stay? It's quite fun. We also saw some descriptions of some other smaller cities, like a city built on a gargant's head, as an example, which is really fun. And they just constantly describe that all of these cities are always under the threat of chaos and attacks from external, most likely from Nurgle, because Nurgle is super annoyed that you cannot do any diseases in the very sterile cities of Sigmar. Here, but the Phonecium stuff is fascinating, and I'd love to see that Tyrian faction in the future. Greywater Fastness is one of the other cities that can be found in the Realm of Life, and this is a city that does not try to integrate or synergize with the Realm of Life, and instead is based in a blight upon the Realm of Life, and they are almost completely at war with the scenery and the environment around them. Several centuries ago, there was a chaos force that tried to take out the early settlements of the Greywater Fastness, and the Greywater Fastness, which is a heavy, like artillery-based and machination, like machine-based city, unleashed all of their weaponry. They unleashed their hurricanums and all of their artillery pieces, and they blew a hole in the Realm of Life called the Ghoulmere. And since then, this has become a polluted waterway that the city has been built around. This initial act was so aggressive and such a anathema to the life around the Greywater Fastness that the local kind of population and the Sylvaneth have never forgiven them. And the Greywater Fastness, not only under assault from Uruks and forces of chaos constantly, are also at odds with the Sylvaneth forces around them, who are constantly trying to attack their supplies, their baggage trains, and attack all of their local patrols. A little cute bit of lore actually comes in here, where the baggage trains are described as being bug pulled. So imagine like a big cow or a couple of horses, and it's a bug that pulls all of their supply carts and stuff, which I think is, like, again, you'll never probably see that in the military part of Age of Sigmar, the armies and the miniatures. But I do love that as an idea for some sort of world building stuff, that you picture all these bug trains and these bug the bug wagon trains just driving forward. Which I think that's honestly very cool. So Greywater Fastness was established in that apocalyptic space, and then the council of the conclave of the Greywater Fastness have said, no, we're just not going to get on with the people around us, and therefore the Sylvaneth are attacking them. Especially there's a spirit of Durthu, so like a big tree lord that is hiding in the mists and the polluted fog around the Greywater Fastness, called Pale Oak, who is always, him and his forces, or them and their forces, are always attacking the local population, which I think is a fun little bit. Also, Alarielle doesn't have complete dominion over the forces of Sylvaneth. You would think, why doesn't Alarielle just tell them to stop? As I mentioned earlier, Alarielle wasn't around during the time of chaos. She effectively went into stasis, and this was a real problem for the forces of Sylvaneth, who had to find some agency, and they had to find a leader, and they found that in Drycha. And Drycha and her forces, when Alarielle returned and was like, I'm the goddess of life, empathy and kindness and growth and all these other things. But Drycha at this point was a hundreds to thousands year old war veteran with a heavily twisted and malformed PTSD-ridden forces of Sylvaneth. So you have that almost chaos, very dark Sylvaneth force in Drycha and her forces, and the Spite Revenants, up to Alarielle and this kind of big life energy with all of these almost heroic bug and nature parts, and then you got everything in between. So Alarielle doesn't have complete dominion over, while they all recognize her as the queen, she doesn't necessarily have complete control over all the factions. And so Greywater Fastness is this interesting counterpoint to the really good relationships that Hammerhall and the forces of Sylvaneth have, which I think is very, very cool. Also, Greywater fastness is like all artillery based, so loads of war machines, loads of vehicles, and loads of industry, which means you see all of these similarities to things like Isengard that you would get from Lord of the Rings, quite obviously. And then they've got all these unique units, which we haven't seen on the tabletop, which are really fun to talk about. They use all of this different artillery. They've got loads of Fusilier regiments as well. And they're described to have different contraptions like Steamwalkers and Golem kind mercenaries, which we have no idea what they are, but they would be really fun to look at and talk about as well in the future. So it's a city based in a polluted crater that's at war not only with the forces of chaos and destruction and other stuff that's attacking them, but also at the same time with the local populace itself, which is quite an interesting kind of pick. You would assume that we've got lots of dwarfs and other kind of like engineers in there as well, but a very interesting city with a very interesting place in the Cities of Sigmar. It doesn't actually say it here, but thanks to Ton Sembu in the chat for talking about it. It doesn't actually say here, but Pale Oak once actually sieged Greywater fastness for some time. To such a good and he did it so well that Alariel had to come up and stop him. Basically, be like, you need to stop, otherwise the population inside we're going to starve. So Pale Oak is this constant threat for Greywater fastness, and Alariel doesn't necessarily have complete control over his actions. Very cool bit of lore. The next city is the city of Lethis, and this has actually got an incredibly important place in the Cities of Sigmar infrastructure, and importantly in the mortality of the denizens of the mortal realms. And there's so much backstory here to go into, and we'll kind of talk about how it works. First thing we need to talk about is the god of death, Nagash. Nagash, when chaos entered into the mortal realms, or actually even preceding that, made the realm of death his. It's his dominion. But previous to Nagash taking over the realm of death in its kind of natural state was where the souls of people who died in the mortal realms, and it didn't matter which mortal realm they died in, where the souls of them would go. And the souls, which were very real, would go to the heaven or hell that their culture had decided existed. So if you were in the realm of beasts and your culture decided that if you went to your form of heaven, you would end up in some sort of heaven where you would eternally get to hunt monsters and, be part of a tribe like that, then that would be real. Same, the hell version of that would be, I guess, being a vegetarian. I'm not really sure, right? So the realm of death was all of these different heavens and hells that coexisted fairly peacefully. And then your culture, if you died, depending on the tenets of your culture, you would end up there. Nagash, when he entered into the realm of death, who is a creature from the world that was, made it his kingdom. And he did this in a campaign of war where he would take over the different heavens and hells. And therefore, with Catacross and all of his forces. So he doesn't own all of them at the moment, but he does own lots of them. So it could be that, in our example, if you're in the realm of beast culture, died, your soul would go to what should be your heaven, and that's where it goes. However, your soul now becomes trapped in Nagash's kingdom and fiefdom, and he'll use your soul and turn it into a geist, or use it to power up some necromantic force, or use it as a source of energy, or make him one of your soldiers in his kingdom, which is really exciting, right? It's kind of it's made mortal. You do have an immortal soul in the Age of Sigmar, but your immortal soul is now definitely destined for somewhere bad, or maybe destined for somewhere bad. And so Lethis is this city which is founded on the idea that that's absolutely going to be something that happens, and so they work towards stopping that from happening. So Lethis has got a bunch of wheelhouses and big bellows in the Undercity, which if you sign up to work a shift or do a penance at them, then you are automatically allowed to be buried in the Lethis catacombs, and therefore your soul should go to the Lethis heaven, which is currently safe, which is very interesting. It's kind of got that. It's kind of got like the Parisian catacombs ideas built into it, which is really fun. Lethis was founded as a city by a bunch of fisher people upon a lake, and it is a dark and murky city where talismans and superstition are very commonplace, and they create a load of talismans. They create a load of amulets and stuff, which are proven to work and have an effect against the forces of death and the forces of ghosts and necromancy and the other stuff. So it is a human city steeped in the magic of the realm of death and its place in its realm and the magical realm. Its peoples are somber and dour and very downtrodden, but they know that heaven and hell is real, and they know that their souls might be destined for a life of eternal servitude in the necromancers, armies, which is really, really scary. However, this does mean that the city, which is almost a beacon against Nagash's forces, means Nagash hates it, and Nagash is constantly attacking the city all the time. The city is also founded on a storm vault. Storm vaults are these ancient vaults, reliquaries, or positions of big tombs where loads of really valuable stuff was once hidden away by Sigmar himself, hilariously. And inside one of these storm vaults, the one that the city is built on, the Midnight Tomb, that's where Catacross and Catacross's soul was once hidden away and had been trapped. But then when it was released, it went back to Nagash, and then Nagash reformed him, and that's how Catacross has entered into the realm as well. So Lethis is a very important bastion against Nagash, and eventually you would assume the mortal forces of the realms would probably very much like to get back most of the realm of death against the great necromancer, but that's probably going to be something that's much harder to do than say. And I really like Lethis. Lethis's place in the history is really important because what's happening with your immortal soul in the mortal realms is also really important as well. And it's a cool city. Vindicarum is a city founded in the realm of metal, or sometimes known as the realm of Shermon, and is a realm. Obviously, metal is the kind of theme in the realm of metal, but this does mean that you not only do you get huge deposits of all sorts of minerals and resources, also you get the opposite. You get rust and decay, which is kind of interesting. Vindicarum is a religious, conservative, zealot city built around a volcano which has a boiling heart of quicksilver. So if you were to go into the mouth of the volcano, you'll find a bubbling pit of quicksilver, and it is quicksilver metal, which is quite interesting. And the Vindicarum city is built around it. So it's a spire city, which is some classic 40k bait, a church spire city with religious zealots all amongst it. And then as you descend down the volcano, you end up with shanty towns and shrines built up around it. Now, the entire city is protected, obviously, by vast hordes of religious zealots, pontifexes, and the worst of the mortal realms, but they think they're the best because obviously that's what all religious zealots are like. And this has come a cropper. This is actually the first city where we're going to talk about how the city infrastructure itself has turned on the city. In most of the cities we've seen, all of the threats are generally external. There are always chaos cults that are trying to attack cities from within, but most of the threats that we see for these cities are external. Nagash is trying to take over Lethis as an example. The wilds even of the realm of life are trying to take over, the Greywater fastness. But in this case, the enemy is within, which unsurprisingly, when there is an other group, as is always the case with a religious zealotry, then that becomes an ever increasingly small circle, as the author is talking about here. And in this, the nested group of Stormcast Eternals, don't forget at the middle of each city, there's normally some Stormcast chamber. They're called the Celestial Vindicators. And at one point in the city's history, the Celestial Vindicators took the sword to the local population. The local population weren't zealous enough, and instead they turned their swords upon them, killing 75% of the populace for not being pure enough. A classic kind of response in all religious kind of states, and therefore the remaining 25%, and therefore their descendants, are overtly zealous. Like, so much so that they might even not might not even believe it, but they have to be seen to be that zealous, because if they don't, then the Celestial Vindicators might come for them. And so this is a entire city built upon this religious zealotry, these massive spires, and therefore I imagine it's an awful place to live. Absolutely the worst of all the cities that we've talked about so far. It's a massive yikes from me. It's built around a volcano, and the architecture looks pretty cool, but it's a big yikes from me. And this is definitely, same way that as soon as someone's telling you they're playing Black Templars in 40k, that it's a big, massive red flag. I would say if someone was like, yeah, I'm a Vindicarum Cities of Sigmar player, massive red flag, in my opinion. But, it's kind of nice to have it in there, and also nice of the author to really, there's nothing in this description is positive. Everything here there is a lot of religious zealotry, and it's been awful for the city. That's what the author is telling us. No positives here. So it's quite interesting. But, obviously that is definitely something human beings do in the real world. And it's nice to see it transposed into, the mortal realms and see it take place. The city of Excelsis is founded and based in the realm of Ghyra, or the realm of beasts. This is a realm that is so infused with titanic bestial nature that even the plates upon which the earth sits are battling against each other, which is obviously ludicrous, but it's a cool kind of idea that the realm itself wants to eat itself, and it's attacking the other realm plates around it, which is crazy and cool. This is a realm of monsters. It is teeming with life. There are beasts and monsters galore. It's a predatory land. There are lots of monsters out there that are going to eat you. Even the horses, which the cavaliers in the Cities of Sigmar ride, aren't like vegetarian horses. They're not grazers. These are horses that eat meat, and they have sharpened teeth. So they are the whole place is just a giant mouth trying to eat a burger. And into this, you put the city of Excelsis, and the people, unsurprisingly, have that kind of dad who's grilling meat for his family energy. The confidence that he can absolutely do it with maybe none of the expertise. They confidently founded the city, much to everyone laughing at them. And then when they do send out, and also their local Stormcast group are called the Knights Excelsior, who are hunters who go out into the lands and hunt stuff. Obviously, everyone in this city-state is a hunter. They love going out there and grabbing themselves a deer steak or a gargant flank or something. And then all of their crusades are the same. The crusades go out there. They're normally a bunch of dudes, and then they find loads of supplies on the way. And then if they're not eaten by all of the local monsters and fauna, it's kind of like the land of King Kong, the recent Kong movies, where just everything's big. You're like, oh, is that, a chicken? No, it's a 70-foot chicken. And if you can defeat the 70-foot chicken, then you've got loads of chicken. That's an amazing KFC dinner. But if you don't, the chicken's going to eat you. The chicken's got teeth. That's where it is, and that's what Excelsis is. Doesn't really say much about the city itself. Doesn't really say what its industry is. I'm assuming its industry is going out and defeating monsters. The monsters probably, in Age of Sigmar, monsters do have a lot of kind of arcane magic around them. So the bones will be good for talismans and for using to build structures and stuff. Same with the eyeballs and hearts and all that other stuff. So it's your kind of classic, almost shamanistic culture who are going out there and hunting, which is cool. And that's the city of Excelsis. Settlers Gain is an interesting city founded in the realm of light. This city is all about the elves, specifically the Lumineth Realm Lords. It's shaped like a wheel, and at the center of that wheel, or the spoke of that wheel, is where the elves live in towered colleges of magic and learning. around them, around the spokes of the wheel, is where the human populace lives. Now, the human populace has been promised vast knowledge and teachings from the elves at the center of the wheel, and they petition themselves, and they train, and they learn arcane magics and other things that they wouldn't be able to learn in, like a walled city somewhere else. The elves obviously use this position of power to create a class state where they obviously are at the high end of that class infrastructure. And while it doesn't say it in this piece of text, you would assume that the elves use their position of being able to dole out power to control the populace. I would also assume that the human populace is much vaster. So the human populace does a lot of the grunt work, I'm assuming farming, growth, protection of the city, while the elves get to live in the lap of luxury in the centre, imparting their maybe racially born wisdom, which is quite an interesting, narrative, and it's talking about what happens between different classes, which I think is kind of fun as well. Also, a little bit of colonialism in there, which we love a lot. And by love, we don't love it, obviously. So Lumineth at the middle, and that's effectively how it works. In the middle of that is also the Stormcast Eternals, who have been assigned to the city, and they are the Tempest Lords, and they go hand in hand, or they train hand in hand with the elves of the city as well. And the city also has a different type of conclave structure to the other cities we talked about. The other cities have 244 conclave members, democratically elected conclave members, or at least they do in Hammerhall. Here, though, it's a grand conclave of only 12, and I'm assuming these are lifelong positions. These aren't voted in, or they're probably only voted in during from the elves. I'm assuming you have to be an elf to maintain that position, which I think is interesting. So humans aren't allowed, maybe in the middle, or I doubt very many humans are allowed in the middle. And then those settlers, they gain the knowledge. That's why it's called that. And then if anyone was to attack the city is obviously an arcane powerhouse. So I'm assuming you'll see big barrages of Luminarchs of Heesh and Celestial Hurricaneums and all of that stuff, and mages on walls casting magic. Although that doesn't really work in actual on-game Age of Sigmar, but that's kind of interesting as an idea. Lastly, if you do speak out about the infrastructure, if you are like, oh, why do the elves get to be in the middle? Or even if you don't like the way society is generally set up, then you get teleported away. Two things happen to you. You either get sent to airborne prison keeps, which is a nice way of saying, you get put into the mines, or you get sent on a spiritual excursion, which is effectively banished. So while on the outside it looks kind of, it looks like a really nice city to live in, be a human, learn some magic from the elves. Turns out that it's a system that you can't really argue against, and that's how it's going to be forever. So that's Settler's Game. Interesting. Yes, although not quite, it's a little bit different. It's like Tortuga or Pirates of the Caribbean, where they put all of their ships together. It's a city at the middle of a lake in the realm of Ulgu, or the realm of Shadow. The realm of Shadow has a giant lake at the center of it, and at the center of that is a huge city and town called Misthaven, which is made up of galleons and boats all tied together, creating a walled floating city. At the heart of that floating city, or at least tied up and moored alongside it, is the Stormkeep Scryer's Ark. So normally we have a city, and in the middle of it is a Stormkeep belonging to the city, one of the Stormcast Eternals chambers. But in this situation, they have their own boat, which is quite cool. Quite like that, called Scryer's Ark. And this belongs to the Warbringers, or the Celestial Warbringers, who kind of have this weird function where they can see their own death, which is a very high elf thing from Warhammer Fantasy Battle. They can see their own deaths, and so they're not too bothered about the rampant crime that happens inside of this. This is where Littlefinger from Game of Thrones would hang out. Game of Thrones would hang out. This is a city of, as it says, cutthroats, tricksters and liars, thieves, assassins, and all beside. Although you assume there must be at least a couple of people doing actual trade. Otherwise, it would make no sense, and it's a little bit odd. But everyone in this city is some way a pirate, and they do raiding missions to the coastlines. Get up a boat, go out, do some raiding, and come back. So it's a city of pirates, thieves, raiders, and all that other stuff, as you would imagine, which is interesting. The entire city is covered and swathed in fog. And so I guess you ask yourself, what happens when this kind of dour city full of like this disparate group of pirate kings gets attacked? Well, it does say that the Stormkeep at that point does collect them all together, and then they're expert marksmen, and they're able to shoot people with their bows and guns, even in the foggy mist, which is interesting. I would be excited to find out, a couple of things. What's the stag weekend in Misthaven like? I think that would be a fun thing to talk about. That would be interesting. Number two, like, you would assume there has to be some level of local law and order. Otherwise, like, nothing would be safe, and I don't think a society could exist. So there must be some rough infrastructure, even if it's heavily corrupt. You know, it must be like the biggest of the bads gets to run the show. I think that's probably the situation, which is interesting. But Misthaven sounds like where I reckon a load of you could do a load of agents go. You could do a really fun story set in the Cities of Sigmar around Misthaven, getting some agents from there, like picking some people. It's fun. It's fun. You always need, like, and also, like, it's just fan service, right? As soon as you create a city, it's like, okay, there's a pirate city every time. Just do, like, you're in a fantasy setting, pirate city. That's it. Which would be quite cool. And I'd like to see what all the other pirate boats like. Now, like, what a goblin pirate boat's like. That's fun. You know, like, already, like, Uruks rocking up in their pirate boat. That's quite cool. What are sea battles like in Age of Sigmar? How do the boats look? That'd be really fun to think about, maybe even conceptualizing art and stuff. Anyway, that's the City of Misthaven. Right, now we're going to cover the timeline, kind of the background leading up to where we are in the timeline of Age of Sigmar before we cover all the units that you're able to kind of have in the City of Sigmar and their background. So the timeline is quite interesting. You have to remember the timeline we were at now. So if you pick up a book or an army and you play Age of Sigmar right now, you're playing in a post-apocalyptic timeline with ancient history being really far back. And we'll start there. The Age of Myth, as it's known, or the very beginning, sees Sigmar make a deal with a dragon called Dracothian. Okay? Dracothian shows Sigmar the realms that exist, and Sigmar wanders them, meeting gods and god beasts, as well as a variety of the native peoples. Those native peoples, he turns up and he is, kind of like the aliens that built the pyramids. It's a joke. I don't think aliens built the pyramids, but it's funny to say. And he teaches them language, he teaches them technology, and he gives them all of this kind of like culture and wisdom. So I guess like he's kind of like an Alexander the Great character, maybe with less of the slaughter, maybe quite a lot of the slaughter. I'm not really sure. Anyway, and he wanders between all of the realms, teaching humans, elves, dwarves, whoever he finds, and then oftentimes becoming their god. Turns up, teaches them a bunch of stuff, goes away. And he does this for several centuries, and cultures spring up around that. While he does also travel through the realms, he does also meet a bunch of the material gods of those realms or of nature. So he meets, obviously, Alariel. They start dating, that sort of thing. He also meets Gorka Morka, the dual-headed god. He meets Grimnir. There's a bunch of gods he meets, and he makes allies and creates a council of all of them. Even the god of death, Nagash, are in his council. And for a long time, this is the golden period of Age of Sigmar, or like the realms. This is where cultures grow and expand, cities and everything. It is the golden time of peace and prosperity for several different centuries. Leading up to that, though, and in that time, during those, they build these wonders of the realms. Now, I'm not really sure that they're covered in any like behind-the-scenes narrative, but I'd like to just maybe, interest you with some like fun like wordage. The bone pillars of Ankdor, the peak of Dafik Mons in Sheesh, the sky bridges of Gur, and the crystal spires of Thorence are some of these kind of like ancient wonders, I think is the right way to describe them. Anyway, golden. But of course, because the author has a prejudice, and of course we need some villains in our story, the human spirit, it seems, is susceptible to sin, and eventually, in the weaknesses of the human heart, and elves and dwarfs and others, we start to see chaos get its claws into all of these societies. And eventually, these societies slowly, they start having cults, they start having more wars internally, alliances are fractured, and eventually, over the course of centuries, society falls apart, and as it falls apart, chaos invades the land. It rips apart reality, and then through it pour demons and everything else. As they do, obviously this kind of council of gods, they go to war with their armies against the forces of chaos. However, chaos sweeps through a land which is pretty unprepared for such a drastic war, and the very long story short is they lose the war. There's a funny moment where Sigmar goes up against Archaon, throws his hammer at Archaon, and fails to kill him because Archaon, it turns out, is a mirage, and he loses his hammer. Literally just goes through a portal, and eventually does get reclaimed, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Then, humans have got a choice. Khorne demon forces are rampaging through their lands, and they're like, either join us and start worshipping Khorne, or we're going to just put you to the sword. So whole nations fall, and they join the Chaos forces very quickly. And some of those Chaos societies still exist today. They gave in, and some of them were already Chaos societies that eventually kind of revolted against Sigmar. And there's also some other bits that happen in the realm of life. As an example, Alarielle eventually gives up in the war. She's just like, this is too much. Seeing all this death and destruction is just too much for her, and she retreats away, which is a whole story in of itself. We end up with the dark Sylvaneth under Drycha going to war, while Alarielle is like a mother who abandoned her children. So it's an interesting kind of bit of backstory. And there's just war everywhere. Nagash eventually falls out with the council, goes to war and loses a fight against Archaon, and now everyone betrays each other. There's a big fight at the All Points, which is a whole thing. And then finally, realizing that Sigmar and the forces of Sigmar are losing, Sigmar decides to hide away in the mortal realms, in the realm of Azir, which is the realm of heavens. He collects in as many people as he can, and then he closes the gates on the rest of the realms. And it's like, it's all over. I'm not coming back out. Which is a bit of a lie, because what he does while he's in there is he starts to steal souls. So over the next few centuries, and it is several centuries, the forces of chaos slowly defeat each of the kingdoms that rose up. And these were mighty kingdoms. It's not just an immediate defeat by the forces of order. There are some strongholds and bastions that last for several centuries. But eventually they all slowly start to be whittled down and diminished. At these kind of pivotal battles, or these moments where these civilizations are battling their hardest, Sigmar, at the moment that one of these champions is about to die, takes their soul and steals it away into the heavens. This is because he's starting to build up his force of Stormcast Eternals, his immortal, heroic army that he'll send out eventually when we get to the Age of Sigmar. And that's it. Some people say maybe if those souls weren't stolen, those battles would have gone the right way. Who knows? But that's where we are for now, and that's a little bit of the backstory. So then there's kind of a relative not calm, but chaos has effectively won. They're destroying the last few civilizations. They're running the last few human populaces down. They're chasing them to the ends of the realms. And then Sigmar the entire time is building up this massive army in the realm of heaven. Enter Sigmar and the Stormcast in a land or several lands ravaged over centuries, as I say, an apocalypse. Although it's fair to say, and for the chaos stands out there is an ongoing and burgeoning civilization just under the yoke of chaos as opposed to under the yoke of order. So there are cities and civilizations that do exist under this kind of chaos control. So it's unfair to say that there is nothing there. Okay? And they definitely are there. But Sigmar lands. He lands with his Stormcast Eternals, these creatures forged by Grungy himself at the Anvil of Apotheosis, reforged in fact, and sent on to reclaim the realms. Literally celestial warriors sent to, purify the realms as they were. And then there's they land in the realm of fire. That's the first place we ever see a battle happen, because they need to secure the gates of Azir. The gates of Azir are effectively the Stargate. It's a portal. It's a giant realm gate where everyone is going to pour out of Azir, and they're going to do all the armies are going to pour forth from. So they need to secure that initially, and that's where the initial battle, the Stormcast, kind of occurs. And it is literally the Horus Heresy in Age of Sigmar. You have Thunder Warriors, you have them reclaiming the land, which is what happened. Earth was taken over by all these techno-barbarian lords and all this other stuff. It's just that. They're just Space Marines. They're at least Thunder Warriors, which is interesting because maybe we'll move on from Thunder Warriors one day and we'll get Stormcast 2.0, which will be Space Marines, which is kind of fun. Also, it's very funny that at this time, at the actual release of Age of Sigmar, people kept calling them like Sigmarines. That's what they kept calling them. They were like, oh, they're like Space Marines, but technically they didn't know their lore. They're technically Thunder Warriors, but that doesn't matter. They're also Paladins. Paladins is a great shout as well. There's a reference to they are pseudo Paladins. You could say that they're AOS Custodies. That's a fair shout as well. That's interesting. Anyway, so they land in the Realm of Fire and then they go forth. They do a bunch of battles, and some of those key battles are securing the Gates of Azir. They go to the Realm of Metal. They don't do that first. They go to that third. They go to the Realm of Metal to go find Galmaraz, which is the hammer of Sigmar. Don't forget he lost it by just yeeting it through a portal like an idiot. They go to the Realm of Life. And at the moment when Alarielle's soul pod, where she's literally like curled up in a ball now because she's so sad, they go and rescue her soul pod and then make it so Alarielle comes back and breathes life into the Realm of Life. So they now go into the Realm of Life and start battling against Nurgle. And then inside, at least the Cities of Sigmar lore book, they describe an incredible battle towards Tempest Eye, where a group of dispossessed have left Tempest Eye to go and take over their ancestral holds that they had. You got to remember that in Azir there were lots of peoples, literally dispossessed peoples, not just dispossessed as in the dwarfs, but dispossessed peoples who had to abandon their ancestral homes, which them and their peoples lived in for centuries. So when the Gates of Azir were opened, these refugee peoples got the right to return, which is an important thing, and then they went back to try to reclaim their own lands. And when they did, they got attacked by all the local populace. In this situation, there was an incredible battle where the dispossessed left Tempest Eye to try to reclaim their holds. Then they were attacked by a bunch of ogres. Oh no, who started to attack them. Then, when the ogres came under attack from the Stormcast Eternals, the Tempest Lords, to fight them, they were like, no, we're letting the dispossessed get through. We're going to help them. But every time a Stormcast Eternal would die, normally what happens is their soul rides the lightning back up to heaven. So it's back to the realm of Azir. So it's a bit like Highlander. There's a lot of like 80s stuff all mixed up in Age of Sigmar lore. But it turned out that these ogres were able to eat lightning. And they literally ate their souls as they were like teleporting up. So then they abandoned ship. Tempest Eye, the city, was under attack from these ogres who had built ice bridges over the walls. Right, this is so painful given the present situation. I agree, but they built ice bridges over the walls of Tempest Eye, and then the ogres were running across it with the Stormcast quickly in retreat because they didn't want their souls to get eaten. And it's at this point, tally ho, chaps, a bunch of Dwarden in what were basically bicycles in the sky, gyrocopters and gyrobombers, started to fly squadrons of them, dropping bombs and shooting guns and all these other things, and then drove the ogres off of the ice bridge. It's a pretty cool battle. That's a pretty cool battle. I'm not going to lie. Dispossessed, you get ambushed by the ogres. It's just cool. It's pretty fun. Yeah, skycicles. Exactly what they are. They are skycicles. So that's where... that basically takes us to where we are now. Well, no, that doesn't take us to where we are now. That takes us through, like, the beginning of Age of Sigmar 0, I guess, or Age of Sigmar 1, and the reclaiming. So we've got some ages. The Age of Myth, that's way past. And the start of like the miniatures game, Age of Sigmar, starts here. Korgus Kull is the first kind of enemy that anyone in Age of Sigmar has to fight against. He's still a miniature you can purchase now, which is interesting. Ionis was the first ever Lord Relictor ever released during Age of Sigmar 0. First ever, like one ever in that initial box set. And we've just seen him have a glow up 8 years later, in the new Ionis Cryptborn miniature. So these heroes are starting to like emerge, but this is the initial battle. This is the initial premise of the Age of Sigmar. Cycle on a few hundred years, and the forces of the Stormcast are doing what they basically did, as we described earlier on. They are attacking into the wilds, they're defeating Chaos strongholds, they're escorting the early Crusades of Sigmar's people to go find new city-states and new city-nations. And then we get to the Necroquake. Over this period of time, Nagash has become incredibly annoyed that Sigmar stole all of these souls, which he considered to be his souls that he is entitled to. And so he enacts this 1,000-year plan called the Necroquake, where what he does is he collects all the realm stone from the realm of death, he builds an upside-down pyramid, and then what he does is he tries to make it so that he can control all of the different realms. However, he isn't able to control all the different realms because it turns out that some Skaven have buried themselves inside of the upside-down black pyramid at the center of the realm of death, and then it all went crazy. And then in Age of Sigmar 2, we got this, which is, Age of Sigmar 2 is a huge time jump from the beginning of this war, several hundred years. Civilizations and cities have established themselves. Then the Necroquake happens, and all of the different realms become infused with wild magic. That's how we get endless spells and all these other things occurring. So that's where we end up in Age of Sigmar 2. To conclude and wrap up the beginning of and getting us towards where we are in Age of Sigmar. After the Necroquake, there was a bunch of pivotal moments that happened in history, but probably the most important one in recent memory has to be the Era of the Beast, which is defined Age of Sigmar 3. This all culminated around Kragnos being released from his prison. He is a god, and his people were murdered by dragons back in the day. A giant war between dragons and Kragnos' people. Definitely not beastmen, some other sort of centaur-type people. And then Kragnos being the only remaining survivor, waging war against the dragons, who are obviously aligned with Sigmar. There were a bunch of other moments as well, but the timeline for this very much reads like a advert for miniatures that you can pick up. And as a fan of Age of Sigmar, as we've gone through the narrative, one of the things that I think is really cool is if you have been with Age of Sigmar since the beginning, those ongoing narrative moments, like when we had the Broken Realms narrative, saw the release of miniatures at those points as well. So we did get to see the introduction of characters through narrative. And that's one of the things I do think I really like about the Age of Sigmar lore, bringing us up to the present day, because each one of them is a mark of, the universe expanding, which is very cool, and it expanding along with miniatures that we can collect, which is very interesting as well. If there's a negative to take from this process, which I'm not trying to look for, but if there is that many of these characters are named characters, and they take the place as faction leaders and gods. Age of Sigmar, as the setting that we reach, the city, we're going to talk about the units of the Cities of Sigmar in, is full and resplendent with gods and godlike characters affecting the realms, and so it's very hard to find a place for your people. You want to create your character or your army inside of it. That's a little bit tough because there are just gods running around murdering people all over the place, or you have to adhere to, which is kind of like an odd setting for being creative inside of. But that brings us to basically that brings us to the moment we're at now. Dawnbringer Crusades are going out thanks to Thalia Vedra and her new creation of the Castalite formation into a world where there are gods who have taken over huge parts of, or they have their own kingdoms, and you're battling to fight against them or make an alliance with them while trying to settle lands, while chaos are very much trying to take you out. The god of death, Nagash, is trying to steal your soul and has taken over all of your heavens, and then, just for no particular reason, a bunch of drunken louts, which are destruction, have ended up also rampaging through the realms. It's at that point that Cities of Sigmar, lads, ladies, and MBs, and everyone else is leaving on great crusades to try to establish a new foothold in the lands. That's us up to date. We need to talk about how the Cities of Sigmar armies are put together and what kind of the standard troop would carry with them when out on a crusade. The Cities of Sigmar book describes mainly the Castalite formations. In fact, after the initial kind of cities and centuries of land, of creating all these city-states, after Thalia Vedra created the Castalite formation, this became the standardized way of doing warfare, and almost always it's only humans at the forefront. In fact, the Cities of Sigmar book is very light on the description of the inclusion of the elves and the dwarfs. The elves are described as conclaved inside cities, keeping themselves to themselves, and only really turning up for a city's defense. The dwarfs are described as being merchants, armorers, blacksmiths, and generally the working class. And again, only donning armor and gromril plate, swords and axes, when it comes time to again defend the city. So most of this book, which is written from a human perspective, is geared towards talking about how the Castalite formations work. And this is kind of disappointing, if I'm 100% honest. We've talked about this like many times, but I will say this again. When Cities of Sigmar was first released, it was described as cosmopolitan. You would have expected or would have liked to have seen a more unified force or armies. And it's true, in Age of Sigmar, we do have whole elf-only factions and whole dwarf-only factions. So asking to just have a whole human faction is super fine, and it makes a lot of sense. But I think you could have come up with some very cool narrative and stories of, human units that are mixed in with dwarfs that are much more sturdy because of gromril armor or rune shields. Similarly, you could have had humans mixed in with elves, dancing with poison blades and all that other stuff. You could have really mixed it all in together, and I think it would have been fun. But instead, the entire description of how the armies fight is all centered around humans. We will talk about the other elements of those armies when we talk about the units, but the whole thing is focused on the Castalite formations. And the way they describe that is that there's a marshal, either a marshal on horse or a griffin or a marshal on foot, and they have around them their command corps issuing out orders to steel helms holding out the front, Wildercorp's hunt units going forth out into the wild and scouting the front line, with fusiliers, fusel majors, and also cannon at the back shooting over their front formation, so very much like a castle, and then cavalry going out and doing charges, sallying forth. That's how they're described as a fighting force. And then the Wildercorp's hunt turn from scouting units into foragers as they, actually carry on their crusades. So that's how they're described as a scouting force. And we get a really nice description of what we might see a fusilier sergeant equipped with, a kind of standard rat pack that they might be loaded up with as they go out into the mortal realms. First thing, they carry their gun, which is described as a slaughter fusel, which is quite funny. A slaughter fusel, which is a triple-barreled device that's as heavy as a cart axle. Also, the fusel sergeant, amongst all of the fusiliers, has got himself a mask, a skull-styled helm, so that if he gets any blowback or any explosions from his slaughter fusel, then his face is protected. But unfortunately, if you're one of the not sergeants, then you are very much likely to have one of these guns blow up in your face. Now, I guess I would kind of be like, why don't we improve the guns, not give out masks? But who knows? They obviously carry their purvase round as well, which is their big shield. And the shield is kind of interesting. There's a really nice bit of narrating here where it's done. You have to remember the way that the lore is written. It's done after the miniatures are created. And if you look at a purvase that for the Cities of Sigmar Fusiliers, it's a big wooden block with kind of like a fine filigree of metalwork at the top. That's described as giving the fusil gunner more field of vision, and also to stave off blows from spears, axes, and other things, as a front line may charge and actual melee soldiers might try to attack the gunner. So it's a dual purpose, and it's quite a nice bit of back infilling. I think that's done really well. They carry with them some sort of defensive melee weapon, like a sword, axe, or a club. They also carry with them a flask of sweet black, imported from Glimsforge at great cost, which is described as, it's alcohol. It's alcohol. It's described to keep you keep your nerves level when everyone around you is dying. And me in the chat think this is a reference actually to salmiak, which is a Finnish licorice-based alcohol. Or it might be a whiskey, but it's completely black as a liquid, and has a licorice style taste, and that's quite fun. I quite like that. It's quite a fun bit of real world that they carry around with them, and I find that very evocative. That's maybe my favourite bit of this description. I think the shield thing is a very cool description. I think that's very good as well. Like that a lot. Then they carry around, obviously, knives and forks and all the other stuff. And they also carry with them a vial of Aqua Gyranis. Don't forget, this is not only the currency of the Mortal Realms, this is also your all-in-one medical healing device. It will heal you of curses, and your wounds will knit up on their own if you drink enough Aqua Gyranis. However, it's also the money that you carry around with you, so you have to be very cautious with it. And I assume you also have to carry around normal water at the same time as carrying around that. Which is, I think, quite fun. Then they describe that they carry around, obviously, their ammunition, which is known as Fingerbite. They carry around with them, like, a musical instrument and some fun stuff to keep themselves happy. They carry around bags of herbs to either ward off predators or to keep away the undead, which is interesting. And then they carry around furs, and if they're in the colder climates. What's not mentioned here, but obviously we covered in like the Lethis lore, they probably also have, if they can afford them, some sort of talisman, so that if they do die, then their souls will go to a place that Nagash currently hasn't captured, which is probably something we see. So it's like I quite like that. I quite like a nice little insight into what the common soldiery are carrying around with them, especially the fact that they're all hammered on licorice drink, which is cool. So very fun. We're going to wrap up now the Cities of Sigmar, the background of the Cities of Sigmar, with another video to come, which is going to be all of the units and the different characters that we might see in the Cities of Sigmar. But that's the background lore, which is so tied with the core fundamental nature of the lore for Age of Sigmar. Because Age of Sigmar is about the Stormcast Eternals retaking the realms. In many ways, they don't retake the realms for themselves, though. What's happened is Sigmar, the realms fell to chaos and Sigmar had to reclaim the realms. But I oftentimes don't think that it's where the Stormcast are meant to live. Don't forget, the Stormcast are souls that have been stolen by Sigmar at the moment of their death. And they are a degrading psyche. That every time they get reforged, every time they die and they get reforged, their psyche is destroyed and broken down. So he is not creating an empire and a civilization for the Stormcast. Instead, this is for the humans, the peoples of the realms. This book is so obviously heavily human focused. And that makes sense. The release that came along with this book was all of the humans. So Games Workshop ultimately, and these books are marketing devices. But I think there were some very clever conversations that were had with us as an audience. They explained why we lost model ranges because they're not in the game at the moment. And they spoke about why we saw these new miniatures and Thalia Vedra and the introduction of the Castalite formations. They spoke about why the Phonecium is gone, but it's not fully gone. They referenced that the Phonecium, at the moment, they're not sending any Crusades out. So what we're looking at more is crusading forces than we're looking at, city defense forces, which is interesting. And that's why the key focus seems to be on the Castalite formations. Incredibly light in the background on the elves and the dwarfs. This is written from the perspective of, obviously, the humans, and I think this is a disservice to what we originally thought the Cities of Sigmar were going to be, which was a much more cohesive and metropolitan place. And as I've talked about just minutes ago, I think it would have been much more interesting to see those integrated together, if I'm honest. So there's that. But there were some awesome bits. I really liked it. I think the idea of the wheel and the Cities of Sigmar hating wheels is so weird, especially as it's like the crux, like the foundation of like civilization. There's a reference there to Rome and how all roads lead to Rome, and human beings have made this immediate catastrophic failing in venerating wheels and therefore destroying or not letting anything touch wheels, which is like a core fundamental of society. And so the author is, at least I think, referencing that this is a failed and doomed project based on religion already. And that the faith around the wheel is itself destructive to its own progression, which I think is very fun. I think that's very fun as well. The chat pointed out, and I think very cleverly, and I think very interestingly, that Aqua Gyranis as the source of life in the realms is also money. It just feels like it's a direct statement towards the healthcare system, especially things like in the US, but also other healthcare systems as well, where you must choose between money and health. Even if you don't talk about healthcare systems and you just talk about, being able to buy better food, being able to have the time or afford the time to exercise properly, is a financial constraint. And money and health being the same thing in Aqua Gyranis, Alariel's Bethwater, is a really kind of nice way of encapsulating that, and will always be a key tenet of talking about the Cities of Sigmar, talking about the realm of Sigmar, which I think is very interesting as well. So it's been an interesting back look. I would have liked to have seen a lot more detail on the cities. I'd have liked to have seen what their conclaves are called, how many people live in each conclave. I would have liked to have seen how they generally do their organization. We only know of one conclave, which is the ruling class of each city, being different. Settlers Gate have got 12, everyone else has got 244, but give us more information. So you definitely could have added so much context to each of those, which I guess maybe Black Library books are meant to do instead of the Cities of Sigmar books. But I feel like you really could have added a lot of world building to those, and some of it was a bit light, which is a bit of a shame. But then this is also a massive book. This is effectively describing civilization. Like, all of the other civilizations do, the Fire Slayer holds and the Ideneth underwater keeps are themselves civilizations unto themselves. But this is civilization as an amalgamation. This is where the other civilizations trade. This should be like a nexus civilization where everything goes in and out of, that has alliances with all of the order groups as well. And it was interesting that we didn't see much more world building there. But there's a lot of units. There's a lot of things to cover. There's a lot of there's these 3 different distinct races inside this book. And I would have liked to have seen more of that in the backstory. But maybe some of that will get covered a little bit more in detail when we talk about the units in the future. This is the first time I've made a lore video like this. I know it's very long, and I know it's a lot of, discussion about the stuff, and also, it's quite casual. It's not a pre-recorded script like you might see from some big lore tubers. But I hope you've enjoyed it, and the only way I know that you want me to make more is liking, subscribing, and leaving comments, sharing it with friends and telling people about it. That's the only way I know that it's something you want to do in the future. So I think we recorded this over the course of 30 hours between the chat. Like, we live streamed it, and then we recorded down sections, and we talked about all that stuff in between. And it has been a collaborative process as well. So I want to thank the Twitch chat who have been a part of this process, because we've talked about different elements, and they've brought loads of really interesting stuff into the conversation, which I love. So I love that, because I think we've all become a little bit richer from having shared our experiences together, which I've enjoyed. So shout out to all of them. And that's it. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think of the Cities of Sigmar information in the comments. And if you listen to it as a podcast, I hope you enjoyed it.